Date with a Debut is recorded and produced on Awabakal Country, and I pay my respects to all elders past and present and extend that to any First Nations people tuning in. Always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. On with the show.
I think for me, books and writing has always been something to do and to fall into. It's that creative outlet while being so busy with other things like my day job. Like for me, writing was never something like I want to get published. It's just something I enjoy.
Welcome to Date with a Debut, a podcast about debut authors, their incredible books, and their journey to publication. If you're looking for a new author to discover or writing inspiration for your own story and you don't know where to start, this is the place to be. I'm Nick Wasiliev, host of the show, and I'm delighted to welcome another debut author in today's episode. If you enjoyed the show, jump online and give us a thumbs up, a 5-star review. It really helps the show out. If you also want to hear episodes when they drop, be sure to subscribe to Words and Nerds, or you can subscribe to Date with a Debut on Podbean to hear the latest episodes as they drop. Want to support the show more? You can also subscribe to my Patreon in the description to get early access to episodes, book reviews, recommendations, and a whole lot more. Wherever you are listening, thank you for listening to us and supporting the Australian book industry. You can also find any books mentioned in today's podcast down in the description. Today, I'm joined by Madeleine Cleary, an author from the foothills of the Dandenong Ranges, a former diplomat and bookseller. Her writing was shortlisted for the Australian Fiction Prize in 2024. She co-hosts the Book Deal podcast with Tina Strawn, a podcast that helps to inspire and motivate aspiring writers. But we're here today to talk about her debut historical fiction novel, The Butterfly Women, published by Affirm Press, which you can get a copy of down in the description. We will discuss mild spoilers, so I recommend you grab a copy now, or at least very soon. I started off by asking Madeleine about her life in the literary space and pulling from her own history to create her debut novel. Lastly, this novel does reference some distressing subject matter, so listener and reader discretion is advised. Madeleine, welcome to Date with a Debut.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Nick.
Before we dive into your beautiful book, The Butterfly Women, which for everyone on the Ubes of Tubes, I'm holding it up to the screen right now. It's a chunky book. I love this book. I have so many questions. It is. I have so many questions to ask, not just about the assembly of this story, but also your life. You've worked in bookselling for years. We were talking about just beforehand, before we started recording. You've been in the public service. You also jumped into the crazy, chaotic world that is podcasting. And whenever I have an author with a podcast on here, I like to shout it out with Tina Strawn, The Book Deal. I will include a link in the description for everybody, so you can go and check it out for yourself. Tell me about this journey. Where do books sit in the life of Madeleine Cleary?
Oh, they've always been at the forefront and probably at the sacrifice of everything else. But if my boss is listening to this, of course, my work is my number one priority, my day job. No. So I think for me, books and writing has always been something to do and to fall into. It's that creative outlet while being so busy with other things like my day job. Like you said, you mentioned I work in the public service and I have a full-time job. So for me, writing was never something like I want to get published. It's just something I enjoy. I've always been a big reader, as I'm sure you are and many of the writers are in the industry, and it's always been a world you can fall into. And it wasn't really until probably sort of 2016 or so where I was like, you know what, I think I'm going to take this a little bit seriously and write every day. And that's where I think, I've started to put more focus into building that world and having that part of that world. And like you said, the podcast as well, it's just such a wonderful way to connect with community and with the industry itself. And being an outsider to the industry, it's been wonderful to be able to make those connections.
Yeah, it's a great show, by the way. I've listened to a couple of episodes that you do with Tina. Yeah, and I know very similar to this show, you have debut panels on your show. You talk with debut authors. You shine spotlights on up and coming voices and more. And now I feel like it would be a miss because you said this was like one of the first times ever that you've been on the receiving end of
That's right.
A podcast instead of being the interviewer. Now that you have a book out in the world, how does it feel being on the other side?
Yeah, it's so interesting, Nick. This morning my husband's like, "Oh, are you nervous about your first podcast interview?" And I said to him, "No, I'm not actually. It's interesting because I think I've done this a few times now with interviewing other people. It really sets the stage, I think, for yourself about, telling stories. And, I'm just so excited to be able to now talk about the Butterfly Women because it's been a long journey. Like it was signed with a Femme Press sort of mid 2023. So now we're approaching, May 2025. So I'm just thrilled that it's going to leave that little bubble of that editorial bubble, that nice circle, and I can share it with the world.
Yeah, the baby's out. It goes out into the world and has a life of its own. Yeah,
that's right. And I don't have children, but so many of my friends do, and all of them have said, "Oh, this is your baby, Madeleine." Like, I've just had a very long pregnancy.
Gone. Put aside 9 months. I've had this going since 2023. Excuse me.
That's right.
But it's also a very personal book. I mean, you've mentioned and kind of in the lead up to the book coming out, and the book will be out at the time of everyone listening to this. So please go and grab a copy. You mentioned that you've recently, you discovered you had a long time family connection to a lot of the settings that are in the Butterfly Women, the thieves and the prostitutes in the early colony of Melbourne, which led you down the path to crafting this story. I feel like I always like hearing about the assembly of books before we dive into the books themselves. What was it like diving into that research and pulling from your family history and then to use that and using that to create a story about the Melbourne underworld?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we actually didn't really know about this family history. So it was a bit of more of a recent discovery. It was a bit of a black hole in our family tree. And my dad, back in sort of 2014 now, he got contacted by a distant relative who said, "Did you know that you're related to the infamous Cleary family, the Irish Cleary family of Melbourne?" And of course, so interesting when you hear something like that. But it wasn't really until my dad retired. And, 2014, I was at uni, 22, pretty self-absorbed in my own things. I was like, oh, that sounds cool. But I didn't really, connect about what this could mean. And it wasn't until a few years later when Dad retired that he got, as sort of retirees do, get really into the family history. And I was living in Canberra at the time. So I'm originally from Melbourne. My family are in Melbourne. And so my dad and I used this as a way to connect and stay connected with one another, that and footy, of course, while I was living out in the state. And so it became a bit of a sort of project for us to just, Dad would find these really interesting things and I would ask heaps of questions and we'd be on the phone. I remember walking around the lake in Canberra, at lunchtime. It wasn't really until he started pulling stories from about the women of our family. So my great-great-great-grandmother, her name's Catherine Cleary, and she and her husband arrived in Melbourne in probably the 1850s. They came from Ireland. We think they arrived in about mid-1850s after arriving in Sydney in the 1830s, just coincided with the gold rush in Melbourne and Victoria. And yeah, we started finding all these articles that she lived and worked in a brothel in the red light district, known then as Little One, in early Melbourne. So that sort of sparked the first interest. And I was like, oh, why has there not been a story written about this?
This is a great point that you bring on to, because I also kind of want to talk about the journey as an author with the publisher. And given that there is a personal touch with this story, like, how did a firm work with you on that? And the reason why I ask that is because, like you allude to, there's not many stories about this. And this is a thing that I'm really starting to notice as I do this podcast. From my experience, there is a growing number, and thank God there is now, there is a growing number of books out there that are shining that lens on the female experience of colonialism in the past, perspectives on the world that have been lost to time, thanks to patriarchal structures that have kept women down for so long. And I mean, one of the best examples that comes to mind when I think of it is a book that keeps coming up time and time again in this podcast, which is Pitt Williams' The Dictionary of Lost Words.
Yes.
Whenever the debut author question kind of comes up later in the show as a great example. Talk me through working through that as well, but also with a firm to kind of make sure that this followed kind of in that vein.
Well, yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Pip Williams because I did my research when I had finished the draft of The Butterfly Women, and I was looking at approaching publishers. And Ruby Ashby Orr, who commissioned Pip Williams, originally her debut was actually a travel memoir of her time in Italy, but then subsequently she then published The Dictionary of Lost Words. I absolutely loved that book and adored it, and I thought, how great is this about storytelling? Just an average, normal woman story, those types of stories that have just been lost to time, and putting that out to the world. And fortunately for Pip and for Affirm, that book did incredibly well, becoming an instant bestseller worldwide. And I can only hope and dream for that for The Butterfly Women. But so I think Affirm, they do historical fiction really, really well, and they have a wonderful reputation. So I definitely, they were my number one, and I'm lucky that I did get offered that opportunity. But I think as well, having that, telling the Australians female stories, I think has been something like, obviously, Pip Williams is focused in the UK, and she's an Australian-based author. With lots of our historical fiction writers in Australia do write sort of those overseas stories, international stories, which have that appeal overseas. But I think there's a growing market in Australia for hearing those women's voices, those untold women's voices here in Australia. And so that's something that I really wanted to explore here in Melbourne. And, when I was originally starting to do the research for the book, so this would have been in 2018, 2019, and I spent a couple of years doing this research, not just looking at the family's history, but also looking at early colonial history. There was really back then not a lot about the women. And my question, I suppose my historical question, was coming from an approach of why did my great-great-great-grandmother live and work in a brothel in Melbourne? What circumstances brought her there? Why were her young daughters also working in that brothel? And they were working, living and working in pretty awful circumstances, living in poverty. They were illiterate. What brought them there, and why were they being arrested for being idle and vagrants and drunks? And so that was came from an approach of understanding, and there was very little to explain why. And lots of the reasons why were coming from men of the day who'd written about these women and had described them in such terrible language. So it was really tough, I think, for me. And I'm not a historian. I'm a researcher. I enjoy research, but I'm not a historian. And then in 2022, a historian named Barbara Minchington, she released this groundbreaking research into the women, and it was called The Women of Little Lon. And she worked on the archaeological digs in Melbourne at the time, uncovered these incredible artifacts that told a story about some of these women. And what it uncovered was that women, yes, there were sex workers who worked in that area of Little Lon. Yes, it was a slum, but there are also stories from these women who had owned businesses, owned property. They were entrepreneurs. A lot of the men had left for the goldfields, and the women were left behind to run things. They had families. There were children. There were circumstances, and slowly that then started to explain my family's history.
I think it's time to dive into this book and talk about the amazing world that you have crafted and created off the back of that discussion with the research. So we get to the part of the show where I have hopped into a lift. You're in there with me, and I ask for your elevator pitch. What is The Butterfly Women about? Okay,
so, and this is the first time I've done this pitch, Nick, so you can give me some feedback.
Oh, hell yes. I love it.
So The Butterfly Women, it's both an historical romp through the early colonial Melbourne, but it's also a gritty murder mystery, and it shines a light on the untold stories of women of that era. So obviously it's inspired by my great-great-great-grandmother, who was living and working in a brothel with her Irish family in Little Lon. And the story follows two young women. So Harriet Gardner, who dreams of being a journalist, not a respectable wife. And across town, Irish servant Joanna Callahan, who wants to do more than scrub the floors of a brothel. She wants to be one of the women wearing silk. And so as a killer stalks the colony's dark laneways, Harriet and Joanna are drawn together on a hunt for the truth about the murders alongside a very colourful cast of women of Little Lon. How's that?
Nailed it. Ding. God, nailed it. First time. Hell yeah.
First time.
That's a winner. That's a great one.
Thank you.
Yeah. Look, hey, no, nailed it. No notes. It's you've encapsulated it well, and I think the best place to start, as we kind of do, give our listeners a chance to explore this lens and discover this little world that is in the Butterfly Women. I think the best place to start is the setting. Gold Rush Melbourne. This is a time where women are seen, kind of as you allude to in your pitch, women are seen as wives and mothers to children. Women are looked down upon despite their clear capabilities, without hesitation. And what I love is that these different women, I mean, we've got Joanna and Harriet, but of course there's many other perspectives in this book, which I really, really love. They all sit in the different contexts of Melbourne, yet even despite that, the challenges they face are almost, they're almost like there's a lot of similarities to all of the challenges they face, despite where they sit in the hierarchy. Tell me about the world of colonial Melbourne in this book, but also specifically this red light district of Little Lon, this area where the brothels were and where women like you say, it wasn't just a place of brothels and dinginess. There were businesses. It was multicultural. There were lots and lots of different people there. It was a hub in a way.
That's right. Yeah, and I sort of deliberately chose to set the novel in 1860s, so early 1860s Melbourne. And so that was a deliberate choice. Melbourne had gone through a lot of change and transformation. Gold was discovered very early in the 1850s in Victoria, and conveniently it was just after separation with New South Wales. I think it was a few days after separation with New South Wales, they announced gold in Victoria, which is convenient. So all the gold then, instead of going to Sydney, went into Melbourne's coffers, and that's why we saw the extraordinary buildings along Collins Street and others today. And so Melbourne in the 1850s was going through a lot of rapid change and transformation. The alluvial gold was, it was one of the biggest gold fields in the world, and so people were starting to come and talk about Melbourne. And so there was a lot of wealth, there was big booms, big busts, a lot of generation. 1860s, it started to mellow a little bit. So, there wasn't that much. So there were still thousands of people arriving in the colony. But the alluvial gold was drying up. It was becoming a little bit more difficult to make a profit. There were still many men who were going out to the gold fields, and they left the women often behind. And so women actually saw an opportunity in this. And it was at a time where Little Lon, which was previously a swamp in the northeast part of Melbourne, transformed into something of a, like you said, like a hub, like a community. It was a slum, but what we've learned and what historians have learned was it was a lot more complicated. So for the Melburnians who understand, it was up near Little Lonsdale Street and Lonsdale Street, and it was bordered by Stephen Street, which is now Exhibition and Spring. So it was a very small part of Melbourne, but inside there were these narrow laneways, dark passages, what they call cribs. So they're hovels where families and migrants were working. And back in the early 1860s, that sort of the sex workers were mainly based around Chinatown, Little Bourke Street. That eventually ended up moving up to that sort of north part of the city in Lonsdale Street, north of Lonsdale Street, in probably the 1880s. And so during that time in Melbourne, prostitution was actually not illegal. So prostitution, so you couldn't be arrested for being a prostitute. What the police tended to do was to look the other way. So there was a bit of a tolerance in Melbourne at the time for sex work. So women really took up that opportunity as long as they were not considered idle or disorderly and they kept their activities behind closed doors. And as one of the police commissioners at the time said, the women have to work somewhere, so we'll just let them do their business behind closed doors. So it was a great opportunity for women. And I think this is what really surprised me when I was doing the research is that, there's great entrepreneurs. Everybody in Melbourne knows about the famous brothel Madame Brussels, but there were other incredible women, Sarah Fraser, Diana de Beaumont, who just used this as a great opportunity.
Yeah, and I think you captured this really, really well with Joanna. Joanna, I think, is because she sees an opportunity for success at this very prestigious brothel, the Papillon. Papillon, have I got the pronunciation right there?
Papillon, which means
Papillon. Sorry, Papillon. Yes, there you go, where the eponymous name comes from. The Papillon brothel, and she sees it as a really great opportunity to do that. And I kind of also want to preface and highlight to readers, because obviously there is a lot of dark elements to this book. There's the misogyny, there is the fact that there is a gritty mystery to it, but it's contrasted beautifully with the camaraderie that is really shown between these women in this story, which is why I'm really glad that you're kind of putting that front and center foremost, Madeleine, because it's like this is a key part of the story, and it's not just about it's not just about the brutal, difficult times, tough times for women. There was camaraderie and there was success in that setting. But of course that changes when this killer starts terrorizing little Long.
I was just going to say, it's interesting you say that. I think having the camaraderie and the friendship between the women was one of the important things, and that was the starting point when I wrote it. I actually decided sort of halfway through writing it that there was going to be a killer and to tie this all up. So it was never intended, actually, having this dark, gritty crime. It was always going to be about the female friendship.
And I love that it comes through, particularly with Harriet. Obviously Harriet, a little bit higher, I mean, for all terms, higher in the hierarchy. She's kind of viewed as being seen. You'll be a wife to someone, to a prestigious member of society. But she doesn't want that. She wants to be a journalist. She wants to be someone who tells stories. There's a storyteller element to her. She wants to kind of be a champion of voices. And so naturally, when this killer strikes, she becomes fascinated by it, and through that becomes into contact with the likes of Joanna. Of course, these two aren't the only part of the story. I mean, there's Catherine, there's Mary, there's Brigitte as well. Tell me about these characters and the camaraderie they build.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'm not sure what it's like for other authors, but for me, the characters always come first before the story, and I think that's possibly because I'm a pantser, so I write on the seat of my pants rather than plot. And Mary and Catherine came to me really clearly when I was I saw this beautiful painting in the National Library of Australia when I was doing research, and it was a part of an exhibition, and it's called A Flight of Fair Game by Alfred Ducote. And it's this amazing painting of these women who've grown butterfly wings, and they're flying from England to Van Diemen's Land, which is what it was called then, so now Tasmania. So they were sort of sprouting these wings to take them to transform themselves. So that's where the title was inspired by. And when I saw that painting, there was 20 seconds. Mary and Catherine's voices just spoke to me so clearly when I was standing in front of that painting. I hadn't conceived of them before that. And I could just feel their bond and their friendship on that journey that they took together, and so that they were the first two characters that came to me. And then Harriet and Joanna, I was reading a lot about female journalism in Australia, and I just felt this impassioned woman, and I just knew I could hear her voice clearly. But the clearest voice of all was Joanna's voice, and that's been something editors have said to me in the past. They can really hear that voice, and I think that's because she's probably the most similar to my own family background, that poor Irish servant. And I imagined what would happen if my family, my great-great-great-grandmother and her family and her women, the women in her family, had been given just one chance to make a change and do something different. So that's Joanna's character. And for Joanna and Harriet, I just thought how interesting it is they're from two very different worlds. It's sort of the Dickens-esque. Think they're from two very different worlds, but they're drawn together by this hunt for a truth.
Absolutely. It's good that you mentioned kind of Joanna and particularly her challenges that she faced, because I wanted to, it kind of leads on to a question I do want to ask, and that is the real contrast of this male-dominated society and the realities of that exploitation, that poverty, and the impact this had on women, again with that kindred and the romance that kind of develops between these characters. And
yes.
One area which is kind of the coalface of this is sex work. It is that world, and that world of Little Lon. And I think a key part of Joanna's story, which I think a reason why it works so well, is because there's an element to it that is extremely contemporary. Sex work still holds a stigma to this day. And while progress is, of course, being made as or to break that down as a method of work, it also holds a very strange place still these days. I mean, for example, I love the work of queer sex worker Tilly Lawless. I mean, her book Nothing But My Body, and she did a book recently came out called Thora, really examines, and she has a fantastic lens on sex work and shows that it's not just the stigmas attached to it. There is so much more to it. There's camaraderie, there's joy, there is love, there is so many elements to it. That scene, I think it's relatively early on in the book with Joanna and William, where he doesn't want Joanna to be associated with her, and he has the gall to say, like, you don't have to live this life, you have a choice.
That's right.
And I just thought, oh, you dingus, oh my god, like he clearly, like, obviously in a society that clearly benefits him to suit him up, that it filled me with a sort of quiet rage a little bit, because and that again comes through in the rhyme, because you are in Joanna's shoes in this story, so you see that coalface front and center right there. And the comparison where he talks about how he sentences women who have been broken by this system as well. It's not, and I think it kind of did make me, it was a real like moment of just, I took a bit of a moment, it took me back for a moment there, but that's also not to diminish how resourceful she is. And it definitely isn't like we're not like romanticizing that exploitation anywhere. It's just it feels real. That's kind of the way that I kind of viewed. It's that world that you've crafted that makes this particular coalface, and that comparison here, it feels real.
Oh, well, that's wonderful feedback. Thank you, Nick. That's what I was hoping to achieve. And just while you were talking, I was sort of reflecting that, yes, stigma is still real for sex work today. It was only decriminalised in Victoria in 2022, so it wasn't even that long ago that those 1907 laws were revoked. And so in a sense, in 19th century Melbourne, there was less stigmatisation than there is today, almost, because sex work was something tolerated, accepted. From William's perspective, he's a bit of a moralist, and he's a bit of a dick, to be honest. Sometimes he's a prude. And so he's reflective of those sort of upper class views, but his contemporaries, his peers, it didn't stop them from attending brothels, from engaging in those services, and they were the ones that were the most quick to judge these women. Yeah, I know, it's interesting, isn't it? And I suppose as well, like one of the interesting parts of that research, which surprised me, was there were so many different layers to sex work in the 19th century. There were obviously the women who, like Joanna, who was working in a high-class brothel, if you were lucky, like Papillon, which is very, there was a brothel, madam. You would probably earn more money, and you would earn a lot more money than if you were a servant or a seamstress or a washerwoman. But then after that, there were also women who were married women who would just do a bit of part-time sex work. They would, just have a man come to their house once a week, perhaps. And their husband might have been aware of that as well. And that's just to essentially put food on the table. Or their husbands might have been on the goldfields. So, just a little part-time sex work. They might have gone down to Little Lawn to work just one night a week. And then, of course, there were the streetwalkers. And these were people who were like my family, my ancestors. It's dangerous. It's exploitative. They are operating in those shadowy laneways in Little Bourke Street and in Little Lawn. And that is where I think, and this is what I reflected in the Butterfly Women, is the fear is that you can fall down the scale very quickly. As soon as your looks expire, you become old and diseased. And disease was something that was very common back then. And, by your early 30s, you are all worn out. And so you may not be left with any other option and no other choice, like William thinks that women have, than to be working on them.
Yeah, it's a very sobering scene, that particular one, when you the more you think about it in the context. And on that point about that, there's another part that comes through in this book, and it's these intercut with the perspectives of Harriet and Joanna and the other characters. There's these your story chapters, which kind of intercut with other characters, where you kind of talk in second person. Each chapter is about a different individual, to kind of try and summarize it as best I can, who experience a myriad of difficult troubles, and there is some confronting stuff in there. A lot of experiences that these women deal with, fighting off this wail of the banshee. That kind of continues to permeate through many of these elements in the story. Tell me about these, because I thought it really took me aback seeing these kind of come through, and I was like, oh, a writing craft, I'm nicking that for my next book or something like that.
Oh, I'm glad you like it. Yeah. Well, I suppose what I wanted to show, there were so many of these untold stories throughout history of these women who were illiterate, who could not write their own diaries and journals. So we don't have that access. And not just women, also, people from other countries, not just from England, who, migrants. So what I wanted to have in those chapters and show that their life is not for nothing, that they exist, that they're remembered, that they were real. And so it's funny because I at the end you sort of realize and understand the purpose of these and why and who wrote and who authored these. But during it, you're not sure. And you think, oh, is this some kind of Irish supernatural banshee who's authoring this? And I had to sort of push to keep those scenes in, because I tried to make it more sound from like a journal or someone who was writing it, but it lost the heart. And I think these little short scenes just give that extra bit of heart. And why I'm telling these stories is to shine this light on these people who've, lain forgotten in history.
I kind of want to end discussing and talking about this book by, of course we've touched on the dichotomy of it, but also again bringing it back to what really makes this book shine, which is the kindred spirits and the resourcefulness of these characters. There's kinship. There's ultimately love as well, which we won't spoil as well. And now that you've sat with this research, you've sat with this historical journey in both of your own as well as in a fictional space. What did writing this book teach you about this space and about these complex topics?
So much. That's a really great question, Nick. I think for me, it taught me the importance of community, and reading and doing a lot of this research. They're not in isolation, these women. They're together as part of community, living, working, there was this great scene that Barbara mentioned, the historian who I mentioned earlier. She'd uncovered just a snippet about these women where a police officer had recorded. He was in Little Lon at the time in Bilking Square. And bilking is the art of stealing a man's wallet while his pants are down. And so Bilking Square was a real place in Melbourne. And he stumbled upon the women dancing to a harp in the middle of the square. And so these are streetwalkers. These are women with tough lives. They're, they're diseased. They're probably alcohol abused. But for a moment, there's that joy. And so that, I think, doing this research and trying to uncover and understand my great-great-great-grandmother's story and her circumstances, reading that really filled me with that hope, that joy, that camaraderie, that, yes, their lives were tough, but maybe it wasn't always that bad. And so that's what I've tried to bring to the Butterfly Women. Like you said, it is gritty. There are some dark moments, but there is also this light and this joy and this camaraderie and this sense of community that I wanted to bring and highlight.
For me, it's about it suddenly turns more of these stories, please, for the love of God. I think we're done with the male perspective on these sorts of stories. This turns history into a kaleidoscope. It's not just one lens, and frankly, kaleidoscopes are much better to look at and much better to dissect and much better to examine. It's for me, it gives me perspectives on the world that I wish I had known when I was younger.
That's right. Yeah. And hopefully we can judge these women a little less and we can understand a little more. I think that's sort of the purpose.
What's next for you? Will you write again? Will there be another story?
I'm always writing, Nick. So I'm writing a story at the moment. It's set in a similar time, but a bit earlier in the 1850s on the gold rushes. And it's, again, about the untold stories of women. So I'm very excited. I'm about halfway through that now. So diving into lots of research, and it's really lovely to start and do some fresh words again after spending a couple of years with my women in the Butterfly Women.
We'll finish off with this podcast and we'll do what I like to call a rapid fire question.
Oh gosh. Okay. I should get myself ready.
I fling questions at you. You have to be ready to rock. You have to be intense. It's going to be so intense. Oh my God. But no, you give me the first answer that comes to your head. And we just do that. We just let it go.
Okay. All right. I'm ready.
First question is, what is your favorite book that you have read in the last 12 months?
Yeah. Okay. So, I've read so many good ones, but I think the one that stayed with me is Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, which is just the most incredible book. And I never thought I would be interested in, and it's set, it follows a man, demon, as a young boy and then into his adult life in West Virginia. And just such an insight into someone whose life is just so different to me. And Barbara Kingsolver is just an absolute master. So I just try and absorb all the craft that she does in her writing. So yes, that one. I'm going to say that one.
Isn't it great when you come across a book that, even if it is set in a world that you have very difficult understanding or cannot comprehend, the writing carries it enough to the point where you do get it. It's the best. It's like a great quote. I think it was from Joanna Lumley when she was talking to Jennifer Saunders about Ab Fab, about the 1990s comedy show, Absolutely Fabulous. And she was like, I still don't understand why the truck drivers in Ohio liked it. Why did they like it? And then Joanna Lumley responds, I'll tell you why, Mrs. Saunders, because it was beautifully written and very, very funny. And if it's good, it works.
Exactly. It's good book. Yeah, that absolutely. So yes, I would highly recommend that one.
Love it. What is your favorite debut novel that you've ever read? Absolute favorite ever.
Can I say a few?
Of course you can say a few. I don't. Yeah, of course.
Well, as you know, I've got a podcast where I interview many debut authors as well as you. So I've read many in the last few months. But I think, okay, overall, my number one favorite has to be Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. That was just an extraordinary debut.
She's great. She's so cool.
She's so great. She's an absolute inspiration. In terms of, though, more recently, so we were just talking about it earlier, Natasha Rai, she's a debut author from this year. Her book, An Onslaught of Light, came out in early March, and it is brilliant. I went through it far too quickly. It's one of those books where you don't want it to end, but you can't help but put, keep reading and reading. Set across India, Sydney, 1990s modern day, about a woman, Archana, who's struggling with her own grief, but there's also these beautiful moments of joy and light, obviously, as in the title. So highly recommend that one. And more recently, I read Christine Newell's 5 Seasons in Seoul, about her. It's a memoir, her experiences as a performer in South Korea for a year, which again is coming out. It came out, I think, end of Feb. But it's such a beautifully crafted memoir. A bit of a travel fiction, if you like that, arm seat traveler memoir, but it's also into her story about her own anxiety and living overseas. So highly recommend it. There you go. You got 3 out.
I love it. Well, no, I knew that I was going to get more because hey, it's not very often that I have an author on the podcast who also has a debut show. So I was so excited for it. I'm particularly glad that you mentioned Natasha Rai.
Yes.
Because at the time of us recording, I'm about to do the Newcastle Writers Festival, but for all of our listeners, I actually in fact had her on the show when we did that live recording of that show. So we got to get to chat about An Onslaught of Light in front of an audience, which is really, really fun.
That's going to be amazing. Yes. I can't wait to listen to that.
Oh shucks, you're too kind. So talking about the topics of more books doing feminist revisions and feminist lenses of history, is there a particular book which features a feminist revision of history that you think everyone should read?
Yeah, actually, I read recently The Story Thief by Kira Geddes, again, another debut writer from, she released her book, I think it would have been over a year ago now, and it's this wonderful feminist revision retelling of early 20th century history about following a woman, and it just gives a really good insights into just, again, an average woman whose story she believes has been stolen, and it tracks her life, but it's a really great insight into early Sydney. And Kira, she's a wonderful researcher. And so, I would highly recommend that to everyone. And I just love that, these books are coming out more. So and it's really it's based on a retelling of The Drover's Wife by Henry Lawson. So that's sort of the premise. Wow.
That's great. Yeah, brilliant one. Do you have a favourite word?
I don't think I've ever been asked this before. I mean, if you ask my my copy editor, it's gaze.
This is my way of figuring out what's the word that you read that your copy editor says what's the word you use too much of. I got pulled up recently. I've been writing some short stories, and my editor was like, "Bruh, you use weird too much. The word weird too much." I'm like, "Oh shit, oh man."
Yeah.
Gaze is a good one, though.
There's always one word, isn't it, that every author overuses in gaze. I had to look up all the synonyms for gaze and just try and delete those. So, there you go. That's probably my favourite word.
I always think you get locked into a headspace with when you get in the zone of writing or whatever, and then all of a sudden, you're typing away, and then you suddenly a word gets kind of drifts into the ether, you grab it and you use it
Yes.
a bunch of times, and then suddenly, oops, we use it too much.
And I think that's totally fine for a zero draft or a first draft. You just use all your crutch words. Like, I think go for it. You shouldn't have to worry about that. That's for later, I think, when you're polishing and crafting and shaping it.
That's right. That's why we have an editor.
Exactly.
What is the most surprising bit of research? I feel like you kind of almost answered this with the story of the heart, but what's the most surprising bit of research you found out about Melbourne when you were putting this book together?
I found out so many interesting things. Well, we did find out. So my great-great-great-grandmother, she was described as the most infamous wretch of Melbourne. That's pretty interesting, I think.
What a claim to fame! That's fantastic!
I know. That was very intriguing. And then another one, so her daughter, Joanna, who's obviously the namesake for Joanna in the story, she sparked this entire debate in the newspapers after her death. She died in jail at the age of 35. And all these newspaper men were submitting all these articles about how the line of the Cleary family should be extinguished, essentially. Very sort of Darwin-esque philosophies on how hereditary, so crime breeds crime, and hereditary crime should just be extinguished, the lines of those who commit crimes. So I was like, oh, well, I'm grateful they didn't kill us all, because here I am today writing about it.
God, those writers, Jesus Christ! I understand it's very much a product of the time, but also for God, oh man. Well, we're glad you're here. We're glad you survived, and the hereditary crime can continue.
That's right. And it's so interesting, because I was like doing my undergraduate studies at RMIT University, which is pretty much on the site or very close to where Little Lon was. And I used to sit in the old Melbourne Jail courtyard having my lunch, had no idea that all of my relatives had been in there at some point back in the day, and that they were considering, whether crime breeds crime. And here I am, doing my university studies.
It's a different. I feel like there's some sort of like a metaphor or anything we can pull out of it, but we won't go any further down it. And if you could, obviously you go to Melbourne, and of course Melbourne looks very, very different to those days and to the time when the Butterfly Women is set. If someone wanted to take a walk down memory lane, say there's someone in Melbourne listening to this podcast and they're like, wow, this is really cool, like hearing about all this, you see the modern city now and it looks very different to the world that is described. If they wanted to take a walk down memory lane and explore a part of colonial Melbourne, where would you direct them to go?
So they should start at Madame Brussels Lane, which so there's a distillery down that lane called Little Lon Distilling Co. So you can have a gin and tonic there in the afternoon. And it's got one of the oldest cottages left from Little Lon. So it's built in the 1880s, I believe. So a little bit later than when the book's set. And then if you go down Little Madame Brussels Lane, there's an old tavern there called the Black Eagle Tavern. And my family actually owned a brothel at the back of the tavern. The tavern was built in the 1850s and it still exists today, which is really exciting. And then if you cross Lonsdale Street, you will then you'll walk through Bilking Square, what was Bilking Square, and then you'll hit what is now Crossley Street, which used to be Romeo Lane. And that's where, so there was Juliet Terrace, Romeo Lane, and Crossley Street was where my family also lived and worked in their brothels. And in the building, actually, in Madame Brussels Lane, there's a big skyrise there now. In the lobby, you can go in. There's some wonderful artifacts that they've pulled from the digs from Little Lon. So you can see, all this amazing stuff. And they've got some great stories in that lobby. So highly recommend that. And you can also visit the Melbourne Museum. They have reconstructed some of the cottages from Little Lon early days and got some great things there too.
There's so much stuff you can go digging and find, which is fantastic.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Last question. Are you happy?
I'm thrilled, Nick. So unbelievably happy. Just talking about the book, talking about the stories, and the best part of this whole thing has just been meeting some wonderful readers, writers, booksellers, the publishing industry itself have just been wonderfully supportive. We have a debut crew this year, so that's everyone who's publishing for the first time in Australia this year. And we've got, 50 odd people. Everyone's so supportive. So I'm just thrilled to be part of it.
I should get in on that.
You should, yeah.
You should really get in on that. It sounds awesome having a debut crew. I love it. Well, I'm really happy today because I got to talk to you about this beautiful, amazing book. Which, for everyone listening, get yourself a copy of The Butterfly Women. At the time when we're talking, it's not out in the world, but when you're listening to it, it is. So be sure to go and grab a copy now. It's published by Firm Press. Madeleine, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on Date with the Debut.
Thanks so much for having me, Nick. It's been wonderful.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Date with a Debut and for listening to the Words and Nerds channel. You can buy all books mentioned in today's episode down in the description box, and if you enjoyed the show, drop us a review, leave us 5 stars or a thumbs up. It really helps the show out. If you want to hear episodes when they drop, be sure to subscribe to Words and Nerds, or you can subscribe to Date with the Debut on Podbean to hear the latest episodes as they drop. Want to support the show more? You can also subscribe to my Patreon in the description to get early access to episodes, book reviews, recommendations, and a whole lot more. Catch you soon! Date with the Debut is a Words and Nerds and Breathe Art podcast co-production.